It's the name of the Honourable Willow Jean Prime.
The Minister for Children and asks, does she stand by all her statements and actions?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Karen Chhour.
Yes, especially my statement that my goal to ensure that Oranga Tamariki is truly child-centric care and protection agency, where the safety of children is at the forefront of social work practice and decision-making.
Supplementary. Does she agree with the Children's Commissioner who said about boot camps that international and domestic evidence is clear that these types of approaches don't work in the long term, or does she completely disagree like the Prime Minister?
Mr Speaker, whilst that isn't a statement that I myself made, I do agree that we do need to have a holistic approach when it comes to our young people, but I disagree with part of that statement as well.
Which part? Sorry, supplementary. Does she stand by her statement in respect of the 6.5% savings that there will be no financial impact and there's been no impact on the frontline services? This is a guarantee.
Mr Speaker, yes. When we were doing the restructure, 6.5% was aimed at back office staff. Frontline staff were out of scope within this restructure, and I stand by that.
Does she agree with the Oranga Tamariki Chief Executive Chappie Tekani when he said that there is not enough money to meet the needs that we see every day? There just isn't. And if so, why did she not seek to be excluded from the 6.5% savings exercise required by the Minister of Finance?
Mr Speaker, whilst there was a 6.5% saving, that savings was taken out of the back office and redirected to the front office, where there was a lack of resources and tools for frontline staff. Frontline staff are my focus and will continue to be so.
Supplementary. Why is she allowing funding to be clawed back from frontline community providers when they say the need is still there, and when she stated in estimates that we need to make sure that the frontline services are actually being resourced to be able to do their job and do their job well?
Mr Speaker, quite frankly, if there's money left over, it's not going to sit in the bank accounts of NGOs that haven't spent it. It's going to be sent back to the organisation to be redistributed to the ones that need that money.
Supplementary. Will she acknowledge that persistent leaking of documents, the Minister dismissing officials' advice, Oranga Tamariki lawyers being forced to seek advice from King's Counsel over a failed restructure, and now headlines about the Oranga Tamariki Chief Executive Officer hitting out at staff are all a clear sign that Oranga Tamariki is imploding under her watch?
Whilst that doesn't come under the scope of the original question, I will answer that. Actually, I disagree. It's not my statement or my actions. You've spoken about the Chief Executive's actions and everybody else's actions but mine.
Just stop. So the only person who judges whether it's in scope of the question or not is me. If the question is asked and not stopped, assume it's in scope. Please just give an answer. The rest of the House will listen while the answer is given.
I disagree with the fact that it's a failed restructure. This restructure is focusing on the frontline staff, making sure they have the tools necessarily to do their jobs, so that our children are at the centre of every decision that we're making.
Question. Sorry.
Supplementary.
Just a minute. We're just not going to have these sort of call-outs in the middle of a question. So you're right at the edge of it, I admit, but it's not particularly helpful. The Honourable David Seymour.
Is it the Minister's belief that it's possible to get better results in some areas with less money? And if so, what are some of the values and initiatives that she's brought to her leadership of Oranga Tamariki to achieve it?
Yes, Mr Speaker. We need to actually focus on where the problems lie. And my focus has been going around visiting organisations to see where the issues and problems lie. Lots were in the youth justice and care and protection facilities, which is where I'm putting a big focus to make sure that our young people come out better than when they went in.
In the Minister's answer to my first supplementary question. Which part of the question did she disagree with?
Could you repeat the whole question again so I can give you an answer?
Happy to.
Well, no, hang on a minute.
Oh,
The question is about the minister's answer. So
I'm not sure which question she's asking to.
We could go on forever doing that. Just give some kind of answer. There must have been a reason why the minister said what she said. A point of order, David Seymour.
In the most recent supplementary question, Willow Jean Prime actually asked which part of the question did the minister disagree with. I'm sure the minister probably disagreed with most of the question.
The minister's answer said that she disagreed with part of the question. I remember that very clearly. It's in the Hansard. The minister, I'm sure, remembers which part of the question she didn't agree with.
Mr. Speaker, from my understanding, part of the question was around a holistic approach from the Children's Minister, and the other part was about punitive, and I don't agree that we're going down a punitive road.
Mr. Speaker, that wasn't the question.
Well, then that's unfortunate, because that's the answer. If you've got another question, ask it.
Well, she doesn't answer the question.